Right, we've moved forward and, of course, as you can guess, simply by looking, we are now working on EZBass. Now, one of the first things that you might notice, and to be honest, it's something that not only irritated me, but a few users, though I imagine that's not everybody, when EZBass was first released. There didn't seem to be a way of changing this 5-string bass into a normal 4-string bass. And consequently, when you are working and clicking on any of these strings, say for example on the 5th fret here, you would ordinarily assume, if you were a guitarist and just trying to translate that over to a bass, you would automatically assume that this note is an A, because it's the 5th fret of the E string if we are playing a guitar. However, with this being a 5-string bass, this low string, which we would automatically assume is an E string, is in fact a B string, a very low B string. So consequently, if you click on the 5th fret here, you can see it's a note E. You'll notice it sort of registers up here. So whatever notes that you click here will register there. Okay, and it's this string that is the low E. Clicking just behind that 1st fret there informs you that's the low E. That's your A, that's your D, and that's your G. Okay, and there didn't seem to be a way to remove in any of the settings this very low B string, which for the sort of music that I'm composing, I don't really use. Perhaps I would if this was for a synth track and this was a synth bass, but not really in the kind of pop or rock or funk would I be using these low strings. That said, when you start using the grooves and working your way through the different patterns that you've got in the different libraries, a lot of the grooves that you can use do utilize this low B string and the notes down here, and can sound effective. Anyway, a little bugbear of mine, and if you look at some of the forums and Facebook groups, etc., you'll notice that initially anyway, upon release, there were quite a few people who were sort of in between annoyed and confused really. Now that's not to say Toontrack haven't listened, because this is the EZBass Modern library that loads up by default, or you get this one as well, EZBass Vintage, which is pretty much the replica of the same guitar, but you can see by the graphics here it's supposed to be a really used and worn in version. So with those, EZBass Modern and the Vintage, you can see that we get these 5 strings. However, as I say, Toontrack did listen, and we didn't get this with every single one of the extra libraries that you can buy. So for example, the acoustic, this does feature 4 strings. So clicking on the 5th fret here will give us an A note, as we can see up here. Okay, so the graphics on this works in pretty much the same way, the animated graphics I'm referring to, pretty much the same way as we've seen with EZKeys and EZdrummer. We simply click, in this case on the strings, and we see not only the string vibrate, but we see that this is where we are supposedly placing our fingertip, and the string vibrates and we see the note up here. Okay. Other acoustic guitars that you can buy, I think the Americana, I can't quite remember to be honest without loading it up, but I think the Americana is also a 4-string. Yes it is, it's a 4-string. And the fretless, is that a 5-string? That is a 5-string, yes. And Gospel is 4. Oh no, I'm wrong, it's a 5-string. And with any of these libraries that you load up, the 60s based on the McCartney Hofner violin is a 4-string. Yes, that's a 4-string. But with any of these, you're going to get the presets here in pretty much the same way as we saw with EZdrummer. So this is the core sound that you get, whichever one that you choose, whichever bass library that you choose, and then you get to choose a preset out of these that are provided to us. Or you can create your own, and you would be creating your own by adapting the effects here, the available effects. And what we see with the effects here, by the way, of course will change the amount of effects dependent on the bass that you are running at any particular one time. So the effects here allow you to change, in this case for the EZBass Modern, the bridge, the neck, the lows, the highs, the threshold and the level. So we've got the compression here to even out the dynamic range, and we can add in some very low sub-bass rumble if we want to, or in fact the opposite, remove some, which is often better in a mix, perhaps not in isolation when you're listening to the guitar, but in a mix, reducing some sub-bass provides clarity for the bass to cut through. So we've got the effects there and we've got tuning here. Okay, we'll come back to all these as we progress. I'm just really showing you around. So we've got the main graphic here, as we would expect. We've got the ubiquitous menu options up here. File, edit, track, settings, view, help, etc. And we've got these tabs running across here. We've got the bass looking at the main graphic. We've got the grooves, very much like we saw with EZDrummer, and also like EZDrummer, we can detach the window by clicking there and have a floating version of it. I'll click there to bring it back. We've got a grid editor, which is empty at present. But of course, if you just drag one of these down, say this one, and then go to the grid editor, we see the particular bass notes running with all the articulations across left to right, across the bar lengths here. And we get a virtual keyboard here that informs us that this particular note, for example, is a C2. Down here, we've got a G1, which we can see by the virtual keyboard, but also by rolling over, we will see that that is a G1, that's an A1, C2, that's a C2 as well. This is also a C2, but we've got a slightly different view of it there. We've got that yellow sort of bordering there. So these, as we will look at as we use the grid editor later, these give us articulations and slaps and slurs, shall we say, so that the actual bass line provided is as accurate and realistic sounding as possible. We get a drum and keys option here, which might seem a little bit out of place when we're thinking about bass, but it's actually very useful and very similar to what we saw with EZDrummer, whereby instead of generating a drum pattern, we are going to generate an accompanying bass MIDI pattern by dragging a different MIDI pattern to here. Now that can be a keyboard MIDI or a drum MIDI. So you might want to drag in from EZKeys, a pattern that you've used, and then EZBass will generate an accompanying bass MIDI pattern for you. Or alternatively, dragging in an EZDrummer drum MIDI file. You can also use the Select MIDI file option here and click open and navigate to wherever the particular MIDI file is on your system. And finally, we get this audio tracker option as well, whereby we would use an audio file that you might have created or you've got from somewhere else, perhaps your guitarist or your drummer in the band or whatever, has recorded a audio part for you and sent it to you, or perhaps you recorded it yourself, whichever. Well, you can convert the audio by dragging that audio to here or by selecting the audio file, or even you could record your own audio here and now, as it were, using this option. Well, you would drag the audio to here, whichever method that you've got for your audio, and then EZBass will convert that audio into a MIDI file for you. So you might not have a bass yourself, but you know how to play bass, but you've got an electric guitar or an acoustic guitar. Well, you might record the bass line that you want to use on your guitar as an audio file, drag it to here, and EZBass will do as good a job as it possibly can with that audio and convert it to a MIDI file that you can then use to generate a bass pattern, a new groove, as it were. Okay, then of course coming down, we get the song track area down here. Slightly different to EZDrummer because this is a musical instrument. We get the chords here, although this isn't very adventurous on the groove that I brought in. Just these chords, C, F, F, C, oh, there's a G there as well. And the MIDI pattern running underneath. I'll just expand that. If you want to change any of these chords, of course, just click on them and you can come to the Add Edit Chords button and you'll see this wheel, this chord circle, where we can choose a different chord. You might want to substitute this C for an A minor, for example, and then from that point, when we get to that particular bar, between 8 and 9, the bass will be playing notes relevant to an A minor chord as opposed to what we just saw, which was it an F? I can't remember now. Was it an F or a C? I can't remember. Anyway, whatever it was. And we get the option to add in our own chords here. Using the pencil tool, we can cut either here where we know that we've got a verse. This might be a chorus, so you might want to convert that. Right click and change the song part to maybe, I don't know, a chorus, whatever. We can add a groove with this button. We edit the chords, there's transitions, options, etc. All these things we'll come to. And similar to what we saw with EZDrummer, at the moment we've only got this one track, but we can add multiple tracks as well, so we can be working on different versions of the same song. I'll just get rid of that, right click and remove that song track. and return to track 1. Okay, so that's pretty much a quick run around, a first look at the user interface. So let's leave it here and we'll progress. Let's now look at using some of the presets that are available to us and how we can adapt them to make them more suitable for our requirements. To be fair, as you'll see as we browse through some of the available presets, you might not need to adapt them. There's a good chance the samples will slot into your mixes quite easily. This is the Easy Modern library with the Clean DI preset, and clicking a note on the fretboard plays the note for us to determine whether or not we like the sound. Don't just select the note though, drag the note to another fret to hear the slide effect too, to ascertain the amount of realism. As I slide the note up a tone, notice the note readout above the guitar indicates a slide sample has been used. Okay, now let's contrast that preset with this deep and bright one. Right, well, I'm not so convinced by that preset slide. It's okay, but I prefer others. So let's choose a preset possibly more attuned to slides. Let's go for this one called Fretless Feeling. Okay, that has a nice and realistic fretless slide sound. So let's look at how that is achieved with the effect parameters. Click here to reveal the effects used for this particular preset. It's based around 3 settings: the pickups used, EQ, and effects such as reverb and chorus and sub-bass. You can adapt any of these dials. I'll change the relative relationship between the bridge and neck pickups and we'll take a listen. Okay, I'll take them back to where they were. Now I'll reduce the amount of low-end EQ. This would help it cut through a mix better. This is it now. Okay, now a quick way to return to the preset's original setting is to double-click the parameter dial adapted. Moving along, notice this dial in the effects section labelled Fretless Feel. Clearly this dial will have a big impact on how much the preset converts the EZBass Modern library into an emulation of a fretless bass guitar. Incidentally, there is a fretless bass library that you can buy. Without it though, this dial does a good job converting the samples from this library into a very convincing fretless bass. At present, the Fretless Feel parameter is dialed up to 100%. Let's reduce it to around 35% and we'll take a listen. Okay, not as convincing now of course. I'll return it to 100% and we'll listen again. The next 2 dials are for chorus and reverb. Adapt these to tailor the sound like this. Okay, as you heard, they adapt the sound to suit our taste. Moving along again, we have this sub-bass dial. I tend to not use this very much, because it can clog up the bottom end in a dense mix. Increasing it adds extra low-end bass that can sound good in isolation, but in a mix can congest the low end too much for my taste. That said, if you are utilising EZBass in a sparse mix, this can provide some bottom end weight. Anyway, you might not hear the effect of this unless using good quality speakers or headphones, but take a listen anyway. Okay, now I'm going to reduce it again. So that's the effects panel that we can access by clicking here, and of course hide again too. Below it we see this tuning panel. If we want to raise or lower the pitch of EZBass, we can do that here by increments of an octave, semitone or by cents. I'll take the playback up an octave and we'll listen. And back again. Notice the note indicator above the bass graphic when we increase the semitone option. The note is indicated as being raised by a semitone. The cents option is useful if you need to adjust the tuning of the bass to match a recording of other instruments that weren't accurately tuned to concert pitch. This is useful for much metal music. Oftentimes hard rock and metal guitars are tuned slightly lower than concert pitch for a couple of reasons. The first is to give it a thicker sound. The second is so that traditional guitar power chords that revolve around A, D and E might be a little uncomfortable for the singer to reach at concert pitch. I've noticed AC/DC tuned the guitar slightly flat for Bon Scott's range in the early days. I dare say the same applied for Brian Johnson too. Moving down again, we see the option to force EZBass to sound the lowest playable note with this option. Open it up to stipulate the lowest note that you will allow EZBass to play. There's even the option to force the low E note to be played on 4 strings only, rather than 5 strings if the library is of a 5-string bass. Anyway, let's conclude here for this tutorial and we'll move forward once more. Okay, then moving forward, we're going to look here at adding song indicators, chords and patterns to the song track building area. Now obviously, as we've seen a few times before, we can add a groove from the groove view to get us started, and then adapt it to fit our chord sequence. Now, like EZDrummer, we would navigate our way through the available grooves, the libraries and expansion packs to see what they give us. And we would audition the grooves in the same way by clicking the tiny playback button for each, like this. Nice, let's try another. Remembering that we are using the fretless feeling preset. Here's this pattern. Okay, so those are examples of some of the provided patterns, but they don't follow our chord sequence. So here's how we add our own sequence with song structure labels for easy identification of song parts. We would start off by choosing the pencil tool, and now you will see that there are 3 parallel lanes that run horizontally across the timeline. The top one is to add a structure label. Simply click and drag, and then, once done, we see the containing box that the chords and pattern will sit in. And we now see this state it's to be a verse, although we could change that afterwards if we wanted to. Anyway, we can now click and drag our chord blocks. Now all 4 of those at the moment say C major. And they are quite short too. You could leave it like that, or if you want to extend them, of course, simply extend like this. To change the chords from the default of C, double-click to open up the chord wheel. And I'm going to change our 4 chords to A minor, the second one to E minor, the third to F major, and the final one to C major. Now you'll notice I can't change F major and C major to A major 7th. You'll notice there is no option to create F major 7th or C major 7th with the chord wheel. Anyway, using the draw tool again, I'll drag out a pattern block, and this creates simple root notes. Have a listen. Okay, well, as we would expect, I'm sure, quite uneventful and an unremarkable pattern, though this is only a placeholder. So what I will do is I will substitute it with a groove pattern, an existing one. If we look closely, you'll see that the patterns contain dots, those white dots, to indicate the pitch and the rhythm, and you'll be able to ascertain from that the complexity too. I'll choose this fretless library folder, and I'll audition this pattern. And now this one, and this one. I think I'm going to use that, so I'll drag and drop that pattern on top of our manually drawn out song block. And to make sure it covers the whole thing, I'll ensure it starts at the beginning of the pattern. And this has now substituted the original placeholder rhythm and pattern with that preset, that groove. Let's have a listen. Okay, so as heard, a complex pattern that would take a lot of manual programming by us to achieve the same result. Right, let's leave it here and we'll move forward once again. Here we are going to look at the audio tracker function that can be found by clicking on the 5th tab along up here. The audio tracker is a function that converts an audio file into a MIDI file so that a suitable bass line can be suggested, then edited and adapted if required, prior to utilizing on the song track. Now, in fairness, the audio tracker option is best used with drums or existing monophonic guitar and bass note recordings. However, that doesn't mean we can't be adventurous and try it out with piano parts. In the following tutorial, I'll use audio tracker more conventionally with a bass recording. For now though, here, I want to push its capabilities to see if it can successfully use a piano pattern as the audio to base a new bass MIDI file on. So once we do click on here, we now see this information dialog. This allows us to convert pretty much any audio file into a MIDI file. That said, the conversion process does work best with bass guitar, or percussive audio recordings as mentioned a moment ago. Nevertheless, to put it to the test, I'll use it with a piano audio file in a moment. Well, as you can see, we simply drag our audio file to here to launch the process. Alternatively, we can use the Open File button, and that is found by clicking on the Select Audio File option, and then navigating to wherever the file is, the audio file, wherever that is on your system. This is the one I want to use for this example, this piano file, that we've used a few times previously in this course. So I'll select it and hit Open, and we immediately get presented with this dialog box. This is the Tracker Session Setup dialog, where we are able to convert, in this case, 3 separate types of audio. We can choose bass audio to MIDI, or guitar audio to bass MIDI, or finally, the percussive audio to bass MIDI option. As I said earlier, I'm making this function work hard by analysing a piano audio file to generate an appropriate bass line that EZBass will create for us. You might want to set the tempo if the tempo of the analysed audio file that you brought in is incorrect. In this case though, EZBass has correctly identified the audio tempo was recorded at 120 BPM. Now I tend to leave all 4 additional articulation options left activated, but you can switch off as many of these as you decide if the analysis adds in too much extra articulations that don't quite sound right when utilised with the playback of EZBass. Anyway, I'll click here to generate a suggested bass line that works with the piano audio, and we now see this view of the suggested bass line. A piano roll runs vertically at the left to help us identify the suggested notes. Notice up here, just below the Audio Tracker tab, there is this small horizontal slider that we use to audition the generated bass line with the piano audio. The slider is a blend option. Centrally, set to mix, we hear an equal amount of the original piano audio with the newly generated and suggested bass line. Let's take a listen like this. That's pretty good, though there are a couple of extra high notes that I don't think work and will either need deleting or moved lower in pitch so they sound realistic. I'll set the mix blend slider to the original piano audio now and start playback. Now let's slide over so only the bass is heard. Now before auditioning, I'll adapt these zoom controls so that I can see all the generated bass notes in view. And because I know this very high bass note isn't good, I'll select it and probably drag it down in pitch in a moment once I've checked it again with just the bass getting auditioned. It will need to be lowered in pitch with the chord played at that point. I'll lower it in a moment. Let's have a listen to the bass in isolation first. Okay, now there are a couple of notes, not least that one I indicated a moment ago, that need pitch adjusting to make them sound more realistic as a bass guitar pattern. I'll drag down that note there so that it sounds better. And we'll take a listen. Still a bit odd sounding, so I'll lower it more, and I'll work my way through the other notes that I feel aren't right. Once I'm done, I can commit the newly suggested and edited bass line to the song track, and I do this by clicking this Add MIDI to Song Track button down here. And of course there it is, and placed at my playhead position. I'll flick back to the bass view and start playback. We will now only hear the bass line. The piano obviously doesn't get heard from the song track. Anyway, here goes. Okay, well I think Audio Tracker has done a good job with the piano audio. I'll finish here and I'll follow up in the next tutorial more conventionally by using Audio Tracker with a live bass recording, albeit one generated from alternative bass software. Right, let's look at the Audio Tracker again, but this time we're going to use what it's designed for really. Either a guitar or bass monophonic file or a rhythm track. Well, I'm going to use it with a bass file that I generated, funnily enough, outside of EZBass using other bass software. So I'll just open it up. I'll click on select the audio file, go to open. I'll need to navigate to where it is. There it is. It's called Bass Funk. So by selecting it and hitting open, of course now we see that same tracker session setup dialog. And in this case, well, we've got the conversion correct. It is a bass audio file rather than a guitar audio or a percussive audio file. Let's go back to bass audio. The BPM is actually slightly wrong. Well, I say slightly, it's quite far out. This should be a division of 120. It should be 80, I think. And in fact, the estimated tempo there, as it says, is 80 BPM. So I'll just select that and we'll hit OK. And therefore now, in fact, I'll just enlarge, or rather scale down our view, zooming out there. Okay, that should do me. So this is now the bass, recorded with other software, one of Ample Sound's bass software synths. This is what the original audio sounds like, rather than the generated MIDI that we can see here. This is just the audio, the original audio file created with Ample Sound. This is what that bass line sounds like. Okay, you have to admit, fairly impressive. This is what the MIDI generated by EZBass has now produced for us, using the EZBass Modern and a clean DI. I might change that over in a minute. But anyway, for the moment, this is what the Audio Tracker option has given to us. Let's try it. Okay, not perfect by any means. It's not too bad, it's fairly good, but it's not as close as it was. And in fact, if I just do a mix, a blend of the two, the original audio, the Ample Sound bass, and the generated MIDI here, I'm sure this is going to sound okay in places, but not in others. And the slide here, not great. So what we can do, I'll just take that to the MIDI again. What we can do is click on here where it says amount, and now we see this lane with a threshold that allows me to adapt what gets picked up in the original audio file. So if I drag this down, the detected notes get reduced. What we want to do is go the other way. So we see this horizontal line. In fact, if I drag that down, I can do it manually as well. Or you can do it up or down, and you can see that the notes that get picked up are white, the grey ones aren't. So let's just take that, well, let's just take it all the way down. And of course now we see, we just zoom down a little, we now see that there are many more notes that should reproduce a better quality version of the file. Let's try it out. Okay, now I think that's better. It's still not perfect, but once we send this, what we've now generated, to the song track, we can use the grid editor now. I'll just zoom in. We can use this grid editor to adapt what we see here in terms of the notes here and the slide down. We can adapt this using the articulations here. We could change that from a smooth slide, a legato, slide out, etc., or another slide. So we can do a lot more with this once we've generated initially in the audio tracker and then come over to the grid editor. Okay, right, that's a probably better way of using the audio tracker, so we'll leave it here. Obviously, there is quite a lot of similarity between the way that EZBass and EZDrummer are presented on the screen and in terms of functionality, albeit one's for drums and one's for bass. But they are very similar, which is in contrast, as we know, to the way that EZKeys is presented. Anyway, with that in mind, I'm sort of jumping around showing you different things like the audio tracker and the grooves and the grid editor, etc., rather than going through in a sequential way like I did with EZDrummer, simply because, well, there's no real point me talking about the file and the edit menus, etc., when you know that they are there. There's no real reason to talk about this section down here, the song track, because this works also in pretty much the exact same way as EZDrummer, with the slight difference, I suppose, that when you add any notes in or a song part or a chord, then you can see that we've got these three lanes here. And as soon as you select this tool, the pencil tool, then you'll notice over here, just to remind you, this top lane is for the song part, so you might have a verse there. Here will be for chords, so you'd add in the different chords, and down here you would add in the MIDI data or the different MIDI notes. Okay, simple enough. And selecting and dragging allows you to move it to a different position. Again, very similar to EZDrummer. I'll just get rid of that, right click and remove. Right, what I'll look at then is the grid editor, and we're looking at the grid editor without any chords or any notes being added, simply because I want to show you how we can manually do it. Click on here, the pencil tool, and say at bar 2 you want to add that A2 note in, bar 3, perhaps that G1, etc. So you would add in the different notes wherever you want them to be added. Now at the moment that will sound pretty dull during playback. Notice also that when you do add these notes in, automatically we get the MIDI data added down here too. Let me just play this back just to show you how dull it is. Okay, pretty dull. Not just because we are using the clean DI, we could change that over to a different preset, maybe that fretless feeling one once more. I dare say this isn't going to be all that more interesting. Does sound a bit better, I have to admit, but that's down to the fact that we're using different effects to create that fretless feeling sound. Now you'll notice here that we've got some notes overlapping those two, and they kind of clash. Well, we'll sort that out in a moment. For now, let's look at this option here, Auto Alternate, and this sets the articulation of the selected notes and pen tool. If you click on here, you get to see all the different options that we can choose. So rather than alternating the fingers like a bass player would do ordinarily, you might want to say, well, with that note, let's change that to a middle finger. Okay, and perhaps that note, rather than it being a sounded out note, whatever it is. I can't remember what it was now. Was it a D? Yes, it's a D. You could change that to a harmonic instead. So instantly we've changed that rather mundane and boring pattern to something, although I wouldn't say it's brilliant, but it's getting better. Okay, if you want to change it back from a harmonic, say maybe to a percussive right hand instead, every time you change it to an articulation, then you will see that the actual note itself changes its appearance. So with a percussive right hand, for example, we see that very small yellow area just right at the beginning there. You can move these notes if you want to, just freely left click and drag to the nearest position that is set up by your quantize. And this is set up to an 8th note, but you could change that to 16th if you want to. So you can go in between. Okay, let's change that percussive right hand maybe to, where's the slap? There we go. And we'll move that to there. If I toggle the snap off, I can just reduce the length so that they don't overlap. And this here, we can maybe move to there. It's just slightly overlapping. So now what we can do is when we get to this note, rather than jumping down to there, we can make it slide down by using these options here. So we can select a slide type. We can either just slide or smooth slide, a legato. And as soon as I do, you'll notice that thin thread of a line there, indicating that these two notes have that slide between them. Let's have a listen. So I'll just come down. Okay, that's the idea. I know it's not particularly musical. I'm just going through it somewhat quickly with you so that you can see and hear the results of what we do. If I want to change that note, I can bring it up to there, move it to there, and the actual slide itself remains in place. Though, see, notice if we left click, we can drag so we have a sort of bowed effect to it. Let's come to here and just maybe there. Just play that back for you. Okay, select both again. We could perhaps change that, so rather than it being a smooth slide, we can have it just to be a normal slide. Let's check that out. Okay, not a lot of difference I have to say, but there you go. Let me change that from a slap pop to a normal note. With this note, if I slide it out, then that first note will now slide down here. Let's just raise that to there and play that. Okay, so just play around with these and then you'll be able to manually build up different patterns of your own using the grid editor. Alright, right, we'll leave it here then and we'll pick up again in the following one. Now, just picking up from where we left off when we were talking about the grid editor in the previous tutorial, I've got this McCartney bass. I always call it McCartney bass. It is actually the 60s library, but of course based on the Hofner bass, violin bass that McCartney always used with the Beatles, and later during his solo career and with Wings too. Anyway, this is the bass I've got loaded up just for variety really. Bear in mind, you will need to buy this as an extra add-on. Anyway, now that we know that, I've placed a groove, a pattern from the 60s library here. Mid-tempo, and it's the very first one. The verse category, and it's the MIDI pattern found here, the fourth one down. So this is what it sounds like as it is. Okay, nice sound, nicely played. But the reason I'm showing you this and letting you hear it is I want to talk about the grid editor in a little bit more detail. Simply because what I want you to really think about is what these options up here do for us. You can see that all these individual notes here, certainly at the beginning, are simple squares, and this means that these are notes that are just plucked. Whereas this one here, this C2, if I click on it, you'll notice now, rather than having an auto-alternate finger picking here, if I select that, we now see that that is a percussive right-hand sound. Anything that takes on that yellow part right at the beginning, like this one, is also a percussive right hand in that case. Are they all? I'm not sure. That one is. Probably all are, to be quite honest. But anything that takes on a different colour like this means, and even hollowed out, I should point that out too, means that this isn't just a straightforward note. So with this being a percussive right hand, if I click on there and change it to a ghost note, then it's identifiable as an articulation because it takes on that colour there. It might be the note C2 that gets played, but it's played in a certain way. It's articulated in a slightly different way. So really that's the reason why I'm showing you one of these patterns that has been provided to you. It's a good and quick way of learning how to build your own, how to create your own using the various tools up here, how to create your own patterns, just simply by dragging in like we did there. Now that's been brought in as a ghost note simply because when I selected there, the ghost note articulation was active. So if I just get rid of that, right click and remove, if I change that to an index finger and add a note, then we see that that's what's been added in. This could have been auto-alternate. Okay, so that's how those work in terms of, just remove those, in terms of the articulations being added. If you notice also, some of these notes, this one for example, this B1, has a slight curve at that corner, and this A1, also has a curve. Well, these relate to what we set up here. As you can see, this uses the legato. Let's try a different one, maybe that one. That works out the same, and this one, that's a hammer-on pull off. So really, if you want to add in, or adapt rather, say this note to that note, then by choosing appropriately here, slide out, then you can see, well, it's just slightly gone off screen, so it's just down here. Well, let's play that so that we can see what that actually sounds like now. Didn't sound so good, to be quite honest with you. So really, just try these things out. I'll just undo that. Just try these things out to see how well they work for you. Let's try these two instead. Just select those. And this time, smooth slide. Let's start it from bar 6 and try that. Okay, quite subtle, but we heard a slight slide in between the two there. Okay, so really that's all we need to do when we want to adapt. I'll undo that or I'll forget. When we want to adapt or learn about how the articulations work and these slides, etc. As we saw in the previous tutorial, we can adapt the timing, the quantization, the snap options, etc. And like we saw with EZDrummer, if you want to change things quite dramatically, with these selected I could randomize, and that now changes the timing in a random way. Or we could say just add some swing to those, etc, etc. Right, let's leave it here and we'll progress again. Here I want to look at utilizing the chord sequence that we previously used when we were working with EZkeys. Rather than having to remember all the different chords, albeit for our example we only had the one verse, running around the chords of A minor, E minor, F major 7 and C major 7. Well, that was only for a short section, but imagine you had to work out or try and remember all the chords for a full song that you had previously been working on. You'd been working on the piano part within EZkeys. Well, it would be useful if we could import directly here into EZBass what we have been working on within EZkeys. Well, of course, I wouldn't be saying all this, would I, if we couldn't do it. I'll show you what we have to do. First of all, though, notice we've got the upright bass here, and I'm just running that preset there, Jazz Room. Okay, so if we come to track and then come right down to the bottom, we get the option to import the chords from an EZkeys project. We could import the MIDI file if we've saved the MIDI file, but the MIDI file might not contain the actual chords. It will just contain the actual data of the performance. Or we could import the tempo from the MIDI file. But as I say, for our sake, we're going to use this one, import chords from EZKeys project. So you just simply navigate to where it is on your drive. Here it is. I've got a couple of versions. I'll go for the second version. Do you know, I can't remember what the difference was now, but they were clearly 5 days apart. Anyway, we'll go for that one, No Words number 2. And instantly we see the chords brought in: A minor, E minor, F, C, D minor, G, and C. And there was a C suspended second, wasn't there? Now the thing is with the EZBass, you'll have noticed so far, if I call open one of these chords here, the F and the C, which I know on the piano was an F major 7 and a C major 7, if I double click there to open up our chord wheel, I can't actually do anything other than just select an F major. Maybe that's something that Toontrack are working on, and at a later revision of EZBass, you'll be able to get chords such as major 7ths. The only option we've got here is we can change the octave, or we can adjust the chord here and the bass note. So with it being an F, if we want to change, click there, and it might well be that we want the third to be the bass note. Okay, whilst the F major or the F major 7th is playing, we might want for the lowest note to be an A. I don't. I'm going to go back to none so that we do have the F playing there. Okay, so that's what we can do when we want to utilize what we've done in EZKeys, all the hard work there. And then clearly now all we need to do is open up a groove, and seeing as we are using this upright, let's just choose one at random. We'll go to this one, Container Rock, simply because it's running at the same tempo. We'll go for a verse. Let's just try some out so we can work out what they sound like in terms of rhythm. Fairly mundane. Let's try this one. And the more complex is number 4 here. It works the same way as EZDrummer in that we start off simple and get more complex as we run down. And the same, if you remember, for EZKeys as well. So with this pattern then, if I drag this down and place it over the top, then you'll notice it overrides or overwrites our chord sequence. It has actually substituted it. That's not really what we wanted to do, so let's edit and undo. What we have to do is use that same pattern, but don't drag it so that it's over the top. You need to drag it down just to the MIDI lane. Otherwise it overwrites it. So I'll show you what I mean. If I left click and just drag it down to the MIDI lane rather than so it covers everything, just come down to the MIDI lane. And therefore now we see, didn't really want to add that chord there, let me just undo. We now see all the different chords here running exactly as we want them. So let's just try that out and see how well it works. Okay, simple enough, but it is something to bear in mind. When we drag a groove down one of these patterns, we have to make sure that we just drop it on the actual MIDI lane itself rather than over the top. Otherwise, we will overwrite our particular chord sequence that we brought in. Right, okay, let's leave it here and we'll move forward again. During previous tutorials, we saw how easy it is to adapt the velocity of specific notes when we are working with the grid editor. For example, I'll just add a couple of notes in, maybe one there and another one there. Well, as soon as we add these notes in, down in the velocity lane here, remember we need to have it expanded, we see that that particular note has been brought in at a velocity of 85. You can always increase it if you want to, right up to 127. And that one there has been brought in at the same level as the original one. You can always adapt these as and when you want to. But notice, if you want to change the pitch in terms of pitch bend, rather than simply changing the note to a different pitch there like that, if you want to change the pitch, well, come down to the velocity here again and change this over to pitch. Now, because there's no pitch change here, down in the pitch lane, this pitch area, we don't see any information, and that might be a little bit confusing at first. Well, this is simply because we don't see the pitch of the note down here. That's up here for us, C3, or this one over here is A2. But down here we don't see any information other than we can somehow change the pitch. Well, this is really for articulations, or in other words, maybe adding in some vibrato. For example, if I just use the pitch tool and come down here, you can see that I can edit the pitch by just dragging like this and back down again, or whatever it is I want to do, and immediately that gets drawn in for us. So if we just play this back, it won't sound great, I admit, it's only a couple of notes, but let's try it. You should be able to hear the pitch wobble a little bit there. Okay, so a straightforward note, but this note, you can hear that it kind of bends up and then back down again to the center line there. The center line is for the correct pitch for whatever that note is, and in fact you can just about see there is a line running through there now to indicate that there is some pitch changing going on. Maybe if we just zoom in a little, we can see that a little bit better. So you can now see that there is that white line that kind of mimics what this is happening here. If we want to remove all that, select it and hit delete on your keyboard. And of course, this now becomes blank, and during playback, that A2 note will be a straightforward note, same as this one. Okay, so a simple note there, and now another simple note with no pitch bend. Okay, let's do that again. First of all, I need to select the note and then come down and then maybe start there and just take a little bit of a movement like that, so it's not all over the place. But now the pitch bend can be heard, and you can actually visibly see the slither of a fine white thread there to indicate that pitch bend. Let's have a listen. Here we go. Okay, and then now this one is exactly as it was played or input by us. Okay, so that's the pitch option that we find here within this velocity lane, which we normally use for velocity. I think it defaults to the velocity, so we just click there and change it to pitch. We can also change to vibrato, modulation, and do the same thing. Let me just select that note and then just drag in just randomly like that. So here we get pitch change, as can be seen, and for this note we have to change over to the vibrato, the modulation, and then that will wobble around quite erratically there. Let's take one final listen to the first note. This first note here will have the pitch change, and then now this note will have some vibrato. Okay, so a slightly different sound. Similar, but a slightly different sound. Okay, right, let's leave it here. I've got the gospel bass library loaded here. Now, during this course, I've made a conscious decision not to explain overlapping functionality that appears, in a very similar way, between EZDrummer and EZBass. I've done this so that I'm not repeating myself talking about the principle behind the same functionality found within both. I'm aware that you've paid hard-earned money for this course and might therefore feel you understand the shared functionality and don't require an explanation of it for both EZDrummer and EZBass. After all, you'll be able to transfer the knowledge about a shared function that you gained from within EZDrummer over to EZBass. However, there is a function available in EZDrummer and EZBass that I think does warrant a look here in EZBass, even though we looked at it within EZDrummer. I'm referring to the drums and keys view here. This allows us to generate an accompanying bass MIDI pattern based on another MIDI file, either drums or keyboards. And as a Toontrack user yourself, that's likely to be MIDI generated from EZDrummer and EZKeys, though any keyboard or drum MIDI file can be used for the source. Anyway, I'll click here and navigate to the EZDrummer MIDI file that I want to use as the source of the soon-to-be-generated EZBass MIDI pattern, and open it up. And we are now presented with these 4 options. They don't immediately textually inform you what they do, though rolling over them once selected does provide an information pop-up. Now, instead of having permanent information text labeling the 4 options, we get a graphic to indicate the audio result you'll get. We could from this point add an existing bass groove to the song track so that we have a bass basis to work with. I'll choose one from the Gospel Library of Patterns. I'll try this one. Well, a bit busy I think, especially at that tempo. What about this one? Again, quite busy at that tempo. So I'll decrease the tempo from 120 down to 80 BPM and try this one now. I'm still not liking it. I'll go for this one and drag it down to the song track. With the MIDI pattern selected, I'll head back to the Drums and Keys tab view. I'll reset the function by clicking here, and then rerun the same EZDrummer file from here. And we now see these 4 options again, graphically indicating what will be generated as a bass line. The first option is a very simple pattern based on the kick drum from the EZDrummer MIDI file, and the resulting bass notes will be plucked only. There won't be any ghost notes or other articulations. Audition it with the play button for that option. Okay, quite plodding, and you'll have noticed the 4 white dots across the top of the option that indicate the notes and rhythm to be played if this choice is selected. Let's try the second option. For this, the graphic informs us the bass pattern will be derived from the snare and kick elements found in the original EZDrummer pattern, and plucked bass notes only will be generated, as indicated by the hand graphic. Let's listen. Now the third option. Now this is similar to option 2 in that it's based on the kick and snare from the EZDrummer file, but has added articulations generated too. Let's take a listen. Lastly, the fourth option generates a bass line based on the leading or power hand of the drum file. Let's listen to this. Okay, so how do we implement that pattern onto our existing bass line on the song track? Well, using the third option as an example, click here and select that last option, and that replaces the existing MIDI pattern timing. And this is the result. Interesting, and when I say interesting, I don't really mean that. I don't think it's usable for what I want, so I'll cancel that. Let's try the last option again and replace the MIDI on the timeline. Let's listen to this. Okay, now if happy with this, you can confirm by clicking here. And that original pattern is replaced with the timing and any articulations from the choice you made. Here is the result. Obviously this needs to be heard in the context of the song that you are working on, rather than in isolation like this. But at least you get the principle of how this functionality works. Right, let's leave it here. I want to take another look at the drum and keys option here that we looked at in the previous tutorial. You'll remember me talking about how it is very similar to EZDrummer with the bandmate function. This time though, I want to use that piano part that we've heard a few times already to generate an accompanying bass MIDI file. So I'll come down to the select MIDI option there, open it up, and then navigate to the particular file I want. I'll go for the piano one there and click on open. And of course now we get these 4 separate options as we saw previously. However, one of the things I want you to notice and want to point out is automatically this is going to convert what it thinks is a drum MIDI part to a bass MIDI part because it's selected there, Well, I don't really want this to be converting a drum part because it's a piano part. So we need to click on this option instead, convert keyboard MIDI to bass MIDI. So when you click on here, we get these two options rather than the 4 we get with the drum option. So the keyboard only allows these two options, a generated bass line, in this case using alternated bass notes and based on the left hand. Or we could choose this one, whereby we get rhythm and chords used to create a bass MIDI file. Let's go for the first one. Now, just bear in mind, I don't know if you'll remember from a few tutorials ago, well, quite a few tutorials ago, when we were using this piano MIDI file, there was a couple of bars, or was it just the one bar? I can't remember myself now, right at the very beginning of complete silence. And that was because I created the MIDI file, the piano MIDI file, within Cubase, starting at bar 2 or bar 3, whichever it was. Anyway, this is the bass line that this generates. Let's try it out. There's going to be this quiet pause until this piano kicks in, the bass rather kicks in. Okay, so that's that. And let's try this. A bit more rhythmic, as it suggests here with the tooltip pop-up. Okay, so it's the same thing. I just wanted to point that out to you when we are using a piano MIDI file. Use this option here rather than the drum option. Okay, right, let's move on again. I'll conclude our look at EZBass here by looking at what we can do to add and automate the different articulations available to us. The way that EZBass articulations work is by adding non-pitched notes that are outside of the normal keyboard range for normal pitched notes. These non-pitched notes take advantage of something called key switching. In a live situation, many keyboard players use key switches frequently to swap the patch that they are playing mid-song. They'll hit a key on their keyboard that has been previously designated as a note that doesn't get heard or even sounded. Its only job is to immediately change the sound of the rest of the keyboard by swapping to a different patch. Well, EZBass takes advantage of the same key switching process when we want to add in articulations such as ghost notes and slaps, etc. It would be useful for us, therefore, to have a list of the key switches used by EZBass so that we can manually add them to a MIDI bass line in our DAW. To find a list of the key switches, go to the Help option. Actually, just before I show you the key switches, take a look at this. This allows us to see at a glance which version of the various expansion libraries we have running. Rolling over any of these gives you the version number that you are presently running. And this means that you can report any issues to TuneTrack if the particular library is not working as it should. Anyway, back to key switches. Click here to see the key switch layout being used by EZBass. All the different out-of-range key switch notes are listed with their relevant articulation. Anyway, let's hop over to our DAW. In my case, this is Cubase Pro 12 for this recording. I've got EZBass running here, with a pattern on the song track and the grid editor in view. Obviously, this means I can zoom into the notes played to see the pitch. Remember though, not only do we see the pitch notes that trigger the individual samples for all the strings contained in the library, we get extra notes added on the same pitch lane for any articulations, such as ghost notes or percussive slaps, that add to the realism of the playback performance. I think using the grid editor in this way, adding the ghost notes to the same pitch lane as the sounded notes, is a good way of working because it means we don't need to keep scrolling up or down to out-of-range notes to see the articulations in use. However, if we drag the pattern to our DAW, things are presented a little differently. I'll just mute the playback of the pattern in EZBass for the moment so that it doesn't clash with the playback of the same pattern in Cubase. And in fact I'll hide the EZBass user interface. So here is the same MIDI pattern just seen. Here though we get to edit and adapt the pattern using the MIDI editing tools contained in Cubase. I'll double click the pattern to open into view one of the MIDI editors that Cubase offers. This is the list editor that, as its name indicates, lists every note, sounded or key switch in that particular pattern. You'll see all the notes that will be heard when triggered are listed as a note in the first column labelled type. Further information, such as position and length, are in other columns to the right. Notice also in the type column we see the key switch articulation notes listed too, and we see the pitch for them is much lower than the lowest pitched and heard note for the samples to play. The articulations are still listed as a note in the type column, and that helps us to understand the key switch notes that create the various articulations are still notes, albeit ones that are outside of the normal sample range of the strings on the bass. Oftentimes it's hard to see the articulation notes because they are of a very short duration. They don't need to be long because we don't actually hear the key switch. It's simply a MIDI note trigger that informs EZBass to play the relevant sample, a harmonic for example at that point. If I zoom into the list edit view, we can see the articulation note a little easier. Notice also we see another type of note listed in the first column. We see a few references to controller notes. These operate in the same way as the articulations, but these are CC notes that switch to a different note sound. Again, zooming in lets us see the controller notes more clearly. Now I'm not going to here, but you can see therefore, now that we have the knowledge of what key switches are used by EZBass, we can manually add our own to the presently running pattern. And I find this extremely useful when creating my own backing tracks for live performance, utilising EZBass patterns and EZkeys and EZdrummer. I'll start with an EZBass provided pattern and then adapt it to suit the songs performed live. You'll find some of the backing tracks at my site, Barebones Backing, that were created almost entirely with Toontrack software. Right, let's leave it here now that we have looked at EZBass, EZkeys and EZdrummer. I hope to talk to you again soon.